All human beings, by nature, desire to know. It's with that simple sentence that Aristotle opens his book of the Metaphysics. Now, some scholars have suggested that Aristotle was being a bit overly optimistic about the goals and aspirations of his fellow men. But I think he was being perfectly honest about his own goals and his own interests. And it's a deeply felt belief, I think, for him. Listen to how simply he says it. All human beings desire by nature to know. Well, in the last lecture, we examined Plato's Timaeus. In it, Plato, student of Socrates, argued forcefully that the universe is carefully and harmoniously designed. It's guided by reason and order. An investigation of the natural world would bear this out, to the end that we ourselves, studying the reason and the order and the harmony of the universe, will be transformed by the contemplation, by the knowledge of it, into reasoned and ordered, harmonious individuals. So Plato's natural philosophy has a purpose, and one of these purposes is in creating wise, enlightened, reasoned, and well-governed individuals, and by extension, states. Now, Aristotle, a student in turn of Plato, was interested in many of the same issues as his master. Aristotle wrote extensively on ethics, politics, logic, metaphysics, and a lot of other issues, but unlike Plato, he turned a great deal of his effort towards the investigation of the natural world, seemingly, at least in part, for its own sake. And thus, his corpus includes the most expressly scientific, if we can use that word, the most expressly scientific works that we've seen hitherto in this course. Moreover, Aristotle wrote on everything. The items most closely related to the history of science deal with cosmology, physics, botany, astronomy, biology, matter theory, anatomy, mineralogy, geology, and the list just goes on. In fact, Aristotle wrote over 150 books. Now, unfortunately, only a little over 30 of these now survive, so we've lost almost 4/5 of Aristotle's corpus. But what remains is still substantial, and I have to apologize in advance that we can't possibly study even all of Aristotle's most scientific works. We're going to have to be very selective. Well, what about those 30-odd books of Aristotle's that survive? What are they like? Well, they're not at all like the polished literary masterpieces of Plato. Plato left us polished treatises. What Aristotle seems to have left us are, we think, lecture notes. So they're a lot more terse. They're a bit harder to read. You have to read them very slowly and carefully and often put in examples or connective tissue to understand what he's driving at. I've always found, however, that even though Aristotle can be difficult to read, reading him slowly and carefully is always a rewarding experience. Aristotle's system was particularly attractive for many generations because it was seen as a comprehensive world system. The various parts of it cohere, hang together in very important and interesting ways. It's very coherent. Natural philosophers following Aristotle felt that this was a system that they could work with. Aristotle himself had no illusions that he was completing a description of the natural world, but he did think that he was leaving a methodology for continuing his work. Now, let's talk about Aristotle and his relationship to his predecessors, Plato and the pre-Socratics. Well, first of all, since I've just mentioned method, let me say something that Aristotle says that I think is quite interesting. He calls the pre-Socratics physikoi, that is, those who studied nature. We might translate that as physicists, but that would be too narrow in the modern meaning. He says that these physikoi, the pre-Socratics, studied nature, but not with a good method. Socrates then came on the scene, and by Socrates he probably means Plato as well, and devised a good method. But the problem was that they gave up the study of nature in favor of the study of virtue and politicae, that is, civil affairs, the government of states. Political science is one way we might translate that. So what Aristotle is trying to do is get back to the study of nature that the pre-Socratics had, but now with a better method. Well, how about his relationship to Plato? Aristotle was at the academy for 20 years, from the time he was 17, when he started attending Plato's school, the academy, and he stayed there until Plato died in 347 BC. Well, Aristotle disagreed with his master on many issues. First of all, he rejected the forms and Plato's ontology and epistemology that's based upon the forms. Aristotle was far more interested in the material world, the natural world, the study of nature, than was Plato. His idea was that knowledge was not to be gained of some forms that were inaccessible to our sense observation. He didn't believe those existed. He wanted people to focus instead on the natural world and studying the things that are in front of us. There's a beautiful illustration of this in a painting done 2,000 years after Aristotle's life, a fresco in the Vatican by the painter Raffaello. This painting is entitled The School of Athens, and it shows a crowd of philosophers, and we can actually identify a lot of the pre-Socratics that we've talked about in the audience there, or in the crowd. But the whole composition focuses on the two characters at the center walking in through a portico, Plato and Aristotle. On the left stands Plato with the Timaeus tucked under his arm, and with his right hand he gestures upwards as if to say to the viewer and to Aristotle, look up to the realm of the forms. Our real knowledge is the knowledge of the forms. Aristotle, on the other hand, next to him, has his hand outstretched with the fingers spread horizontally, as if to say, no, Plato, you're wrong. It's the world out here. This is where we get knowledge. Study the natural world. Well, Raffaello clearly knew his pre-Socratics and his Plato and Aristotle very well to depict them in this way. By the way, I should mention that if the image of Plato looks slightly familiar to you, it's because the artist used the face of Leonardo da Vinci for Plato. Da Vinci was deeply influenced by Plato. Well, Aristotle provides his own solution to the two chief questions of the pre-Socratics. What are things made of, and what's the nature of change? Let's talk about what things are made of first. Aristotle takes a monist position. Remember the difference between monism and pluralism. The monists say that the material substratum of all things is just one uniform material. Aristotle takes that view. What is this stuff that makes up the world? Well, Thales, you'll remember, suggested it was water, and Anaximenes suggested it was air. But for Aristotle, it's no substance that we see in the natural world. It is a universal, just stuff that has no qualities whatsoever. No qualities. And he just calls it hule, matter in Greek. Sometimes we call it prime matter. Clearly, Aristotle is not particularly interested in the stuff that things are made of. And he says this very clearly when he gives the example of a house. Well, what's a house made of? We can answer it's made of bricks. But does that answer tell us anything about the house, really? Because a pile of bricks is made of bricks the same way. The matter is not so important. What is important is the way, the reason, the method in which the matter is put together. In other words, the form. Individual objects arise when matter is imprinted with a form, morphe in Greek. This form is the sum total of all the qualities of the thing. So whether what its color is, red or black, hot, bitter, smooth, sharp, shiny, dull, all those qualities. Aristotle says that prime matter takes the form the way a lump of wax takes the impression of a seal. So that means we could take a lump of wax, press it in with a seal into one form, then use another seal and print it again, and keep doing that and changing the form, but the matter remains. Matter and form for Aristotle never exist independently of one another. This doctrine of Aristotle's, by the way, is called hylomorphism, from the two Greek words hule and morphe, matter and form. What about change? Well, change is simply the replacement of one form by another. The prime matter remains unchanged, just the way we could take a lump of lead, melt it down and cast it into, let's say, bullets, then melt the bullets down and cast it into statues, melt the statues down and cast it into little balls or whatever we wanted. The prime matter remains, the stuff that things are made out of, but the form changes. In this way, Aristotle has a compromise between Heraclitus and Parmenides, both change and constancy. But Aristotle's world is a lot more like Heraclitus's than like Parmenides. For Aristotle, the world is a dynamic place. A motto applied to Aristotle is that the only thing constant is change. But change occurs along a continuum of pairs of contrary qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, white, black. So change involves a movement from one end of a continuum to another, a continuum of qualities. Change also always involves a movement from potentiality to actuality. Let's give an example. You get up in the morning, go downstairs, fill up your kettle with cold water, put it on the stove, and turn on the fire underneath it. In due course, the water gets hot. That's a change in the water. The cold water you put in the pot was actually cold, but potentially hot. And so in heating it up, the potential of the water was actualized. It became actually hot, and it moved in the continuum from cold to hot. But one thing cannot be immediately turned into just anything else under all circumstances. And an example Aristotle uses is a cow goes out in a field, chews up on some grass. The grass is swallowed. In the cow's stomach, the prime matter that the grass is made out of is imprinted with a new form, and milk comes out of more or less the other end of the cow. That means that the grass was potentially milk. If the cow ate a rock, you wouldn't get any milk because the rock is not potentially milk in the context of a cow's stomach. Well, how do we get knowledge, and what is true knowledge? True knowledge for Aristotle is knowledge of the causes of a thing. It is causal knowledge, knowledge of why a thing is as it is. Not knowledge of the forms, mind you, like Plato would say, but knowledge of why a thing is the way it is. Now, this is distinct from artifice. Aristotle uses two different words for the two different kinds of knowledge. The causal knowledge that he wants you to have is episteme, the word we get epistemology from. Artifice, craft, art is techne. It's the knowledge of how to do something or how to make something. So, knowledge of causes, knowledge of craft. What are the causes that constitute knowledge? Well, Aristotle, being exhaustive, as he likes to be, this is a characteristic of Aristotle, cataloging, classifying, being exhaustive. He lists that there are four causes, as he calls them. Don't get hung up on the word cause, and you'll see why in a minute. Four causes of things. These are called the efficient cause, which is what makes a thing what it is, the formal cause, what its form is, the material cause, what it's made of, and the final cause, what its reason for being is. What the causes do is it gives an exhaustive list of things to study in an object. And once you've studied these, it puts the object into a web of correspondences with other objects around it so that you can understand it in context. Let's use the four causes for a moment. That's the only way we actually really understand Aristotle, is to use him. Let's imagine we're back in ancient Athens. Right? We go to the Stoa, the Greek Forum, and there's a large, beautiful, monumental bronze statue of Achilles. What are the causes of the statue, according to Aristotle? The efficient cause is the sculptor and the caster who made it. So let's say Phidias. The material cause is the bronze of the statue, out of which it is made. Now you might say, wait a minute, isn't everything prime matter? Well, yes, ultimately, but the immediate material cause is the bronze. Prime matter is more distant. The form is the shape of Achilles, in which the statue is made. The final cause, however, is to decorate the Stoa or to commemorate the glory of Achilles. It's the purpose for which it is made. Now, the final cause is almost invariably the most difficult for moderns to accept, but I argue it is the key to understanding all of Aristotle's natural philosophy. It's the linchpin to his system. First of all, it preserves and develops Plato's idea of purposefulness in nature, and it also embodies Aristotle's view of nature. Aristotle says, whatever nature makes to serve some purpose. Now, just for a moment, let's talk about nature. What do we mean by nature? Well, our English word nature comes from the Latin natura, which is based in turn upon the Latin verb natur, which is to be born, to come to be generated. The same thing is true in Greek. Aristotle's word for nature is physis, which comes from the Greek word phuo, which again means to beget, to generate, to cause to come forth. So nature, for him, when he talks about nature, it's what is generated, what comes forth, what comes to be. So we get a little bit of a twisted view when we translate his book called The Physics, Physica, as physics, because it's not modern physics, right? It's of natural things. Now, to understand Aristotle's view of nature, we have to also understand the fundamental divide that Aristotle posits between natural objects and artificial objects. They're different things. Natural objects all have what he calls an internal principle of motion or change. We might also translate that as an internal propensity towards motion or change. This principle of motion or change propels the natural object on towards its final cause. An acorn, for example, we put it in the ground and it grows into an oak tree without our having to do anything. It naturally becomes an oak tree because, as we still say, echoing Aristotelian ideas, that's in its nature. It is its nature to do so. What about the quotation I started the lecture with? All human beings by nature desire to know. We can read this as saying that all human beings have within them a natural propensity propelling them towards what might be considered their final cause, namely, to know. Very interesting view of man and how he's propelled. Nature would, in fact, be the ultimate spokesman or spokeswoman for the army. Be all you can be. That's what nature is about, the ultimate actualization of the potentials in things. Now, artificial things lack this internal principle of motion. Motion or change comes only to them from external agents. There is no internal agent of change. For example, a bed. If we take a bed and put it in the ground, nothing happens. It just rots. Unlike an acorn that we put in the ground and it grows into a tree. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute. The bed rotted. That's a change, isn't it? Yes, it is. But it doesn't change, it doesn't rot because it's a bed. It rots because it's made out of wood. And Aristotle, if he's good at anything, and he is, he's good at drawing distinctions and focusing our attention on just what's essential to his argument. The bed rots as a piece of wood. The bed does not rot as a bed. Okay? You see the distinction. Artificial things cannot move on towards their final end without guidance from some external agent. So that is to say, if I had a chair here, the chair's final end is to provide some place for me to rest my tired bones. If I, as an external agent, do not decide to sit in it and then sit in it, it has not reached its final end. It needs an external agent to bring it to that final end. I might just mention that this distinction between the artificial and the natural persists to this day in the popular imagination, even with scientific evidence to the contrary. For example, some people will swear up and down that vitamin C that comes out of an orange is somehow different from vitamin C that's in a tablet that's made in a chemical factory. Now, part of this comes from an unfamiliarity with the chemical structure of compounds, but some of it may be sort of a gut feeling that's handed down to us about the works of nature, an idea that comes from Aristotle and his successors. Final causes now are formally rejected by modern science. Why? They do not fit into modern worldviews. Modern worldviews don't see a world with purpose and direction. We look at individual objects in the world, but we tend not to look at their purpose and at their direction. The use of final causes, which is also called teleology, from the Greek telos, which is a goal, that is, we define something or we explain something by the goal towards which it is going towards, those are rejected. There's a sequence of time problem, isn't there? It's hard for us to imagine logically how the end state of something can affect the beginning state. It seems that something later in time is affecting something earlier. But in popularizations of science, if you look carefully, and I challenge you to do this when you read popularizations, when you go to museums, look and you'll find loads of final causes, loads of arguments from teleology. Why does a bird have a wing? Well, in order to fly. Okay. In fact, in biological systems, in biological explanations, final causes are very frequently found. They're even found in, let's say, chemical ones. Let's use an example. We say that a chemical system tends towards the lowest energy state. Well, how can it do that? It doesn't know where it's going. How can something that's a later state influence the earlier state? Well, it can't, but it's a method of common speech. We can rearrange the explanation in terms of statistics and mathematics. It totally does away with final causation, and that's fine. But there's something sort of commonsensical about final causes. We tend to accept them. And as I started to say, biology is a place where we tend to see them most of all. You've probably all seen the panorama of evolution, where you start with some hairy, hunchbacked creature, and at the end you have an upright, standing, far less hairy guy in a loincloth with a spear. That kind of an exhibit encompasses final causation, because it looks like there's a directed motion towards that final individual. Now, of course, a good evolutionary biologist will talk about natural selection and randomness and pathways that were dead ends. That's fine. But when we show it in that way, we're appealing, in a sense, to final causation. And this is really, I think, a clue to understanding Aristotle. We make the mistake many times of thinking of Aristotle's cosmology and physics primarily. I want to argue that we should think of him primarily in terms of his biological work. I think his biological studies undergird, his biological interests undergird the rest of what he has to say. If you really want to understand Aristotle, try wading through the physics and the metaphysics, and it's a tough slog, but try it, and then go and read book one of Parts of Animals, or Motion of Animals, and it will all become vastly clearer. Now, Aristotle spent many years in biological studies. For 12 years, he was outside of Athens from the death of Plato in 347 until 335 BC. And he spent a lot of that time in the Eastern Aegean looking at biological, botanical, anatomical studies. Now, he was a very keen observer. And even though his work sometimes incorporates hearsay, for example, the story of how the bison can elude hunters and predators by ejecting its scalding hot excrement up to 25 feet away to scare them off. I think that would be rather scary, yes. But he also recorded several things that show that he was such a keen observer that people didn't believe him for many years. And only in more recent times has he been proved correct. For example, he says that the male octopus, uses one of its tentacles to copulate. Well, in fact, this is true. And this wasn't actually unambiguously shown to be true until the 19th century. But the point I want to make now is that for Aristotle, living things show the workings of the natural world better than non-living things. He even makes the bold statement that the final cause is more evident in natural things than in artificial ones. Now, if you think about that, that really is bold. The final cause is more evident in natural things. Well, yes, causation and directed purposefulness are clear in nutrition and growth and anatomy. If we have a child, the child grows up to be an adult. It doesn't grow up to be an aardvark or a grapefruit. It grows up to be one thing and one thing alone, an adult human being, clearly directed towards some kind of final cause, some kind of final end. Purpose is very clear in dissections, for example. We know that Aristotle did lots and lots of dissections. Unfortunately, his book on dissections is lost. It was probably lost quite early, because we have reason to believe that the book on dissections was largely composed of diagrams of the internal organs of various animals that he had dissected. Now, if you think about how copyists work, unless you're a very good artist, you're not going to take that book to copy. And so as a result, it didn't get copied, and it hasn't been passed down to us. But when we look at Aristotle's interest in biology, we can understand his insistence on final causation. He says in one place, "The complete animal is the cause for which the seed exists. The seed would not exist were it not intended to mature into the animal." So that means that even though the end is temporally after the means, it's logically prior to the means. The end is logically prior to the means. Now, Aristotle, in taking life systems as fundamental, does something that's inherently different from what we do. We tend to look towards physics as the fundamental science in terms of which everything else is to be explained. For Aristotle, his illustrations are drawn from living systems. Now, this has a couple of consequences. For Aristotle, life helps explain non-living matter. For us, life becomes something that has to be explained in terms of non-life. So life is a problem for us. We don't know what to do with life. We try and we try to figure out some way of explaining why there is life. Aristotle didn't ask that question. For him, life was all around us. Life didn't need to be explained any more than existence itself needed to be explained. Existence means life. So there's a completely inverted sense between the modern and the Aristotelian view. And this helps us to explain things like his cosmology and his physics and his dynamics that we're going to talk about in the next lecture. Now, let me say something else about this. Who's right? Which should be the fundamental way of looking at the world? Do we take life as our starting point and then use it to explain non-living systems? Well, that's not what we do nowadays. Or should we start with non-life, the basic fundamental building blocks which we assume have no life of their own, and go to explain living systems as somehow built up out of non-life? Well, it's a conscious choice either way. Moderns have made one choice. Aristotle made a different choice. And it's not really a self-evident choice. And we can think of advantages and disadvantages, I think, of both systems. So when modern science looks very different from Aristotelian science, we have to understand that the questions that were being asked were different, and they were based upon a different set of assumptions. Now, armed with this realization that Aristotle's dynamics and cosmology may in fact be based on biological exemplars, we're going to be able to understand that dynamics and cosmology a little bit more easily in the next lecture when we come to treat them.